Hi guys! First of all, please ignore my voice. I have a cold. And secondly, today we're talking about Outlander, which has been my favorite show for I think the past 7 years. I mean, this and Game of Thrones, of course. I love my period dramas. And season 8 just came out, as you may know, and I'm genuinely over the moon about it. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm catching up because I'm currently watching The Pit. So, yeah. I fucking love this show. I first started watching it back when I was in university, in my second year, I think. I was around 20, and I fell in love with it immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean immediately. There was no slow build, no let's give it like 3 episodes to see what it's about. I just opened the TV show and I was completely sucked in. Because I have said this so many times before that I think people are getting tired of hearing it, but I love Scotland so much. And, this show happens in Scotland, so... What is funny is that I loved Outlander first in a completely emotional way. I loved the feeling of it, the characters, the music, the scenery, the costumes. And at that point, I wasn't even as analytical about film and television as I am now. I just simply loved it. And years later, when I started researching adaptation and historical fiction more seriously, I came back to the show from a completely different angle, and suddenly I realized something that made me love it even more. Outlander is not just addictive television. It is also incredibly well constructed. People often talk about this show like it's only just a romance with time travel, and obviously it is a romance with time travel. But it's also one of the perfect examples of how historical fiction can work on screen without feeling heavy or academic, because the show understands something very simple but very important. History becomes interesting the moment it feels human, not when it feels like a textbook. And Outlander is very good at making the past feel human. When you watch a lot of period dramas, they can often feel like a museum. Everything looks beautiful but a little too polished. Everything seems too controlled. The clothes are very clean. It's like you're observing history but behind a glass. Outlander doesn't feel like that. And the big reason this works is Claire. Instead of just reconstructing the past, it drops a modern perspective directly into it. So Claire is not just a protagonist, but she works as a narrative device. Through her, the audience experiences the 18th century mixed with some sort of familiarity and shock. She understands modern medicine. She has lived through a world war. She has a sense of autonomy that simply didn't exist for the women in 1740s. When she arrives in 18th century Scotland, the audience experiences that world through her eyes. The social rules, the gender expectations, the violence, the political tensions, everything feels immediate because we are seeing it through her eyes, and she's a modern woman and she does not belong there, so obviously we feel the same way. So this contrast allows the series to follow these historical realities while keeping the audiences emotionally grounded in the story. Another reason the show works so well is the way it balances history and fiction. There has always been this debate surrounding historical fiction that it should completely be accurate and represent, the era is trying to represent, to be as historically accurate as possible. Others argue that its primary goal is simply storytelling, because after all, it's historical fiction, not just history or historical record. Diana Gabaldon, the author, has addressed this many times during her interviews. One of the things she points out is that history itself is not always perfectly reliable. And this has also been discussed by researchers before. Historical records are incomplete, they are biased. They are written by the people who had the power to record them, so they are obviously biased. So historical fiction inevitably becomes an interpretation. So I do believe that its primary goal is to fill in these gaps left behind by historical documentation, and Outlander embraces that idea very openly. The series does include a lot of real historical events that have happened. It introduces real historical figures like Charles Edward Stuart and King Louis XV, but at the same time, it allows its fictional characters to move through those events, to experience them, and to shape the narrative emotionally. And the time travel element actually helps a lot with that. Claire enters the past already knowing how certain historical events will end. She knows Collodion is coming. The audience knows Collodion is coming. And that creates a real powerful narrative tension. The characters try to intervene in history, to change its course, to prevent certain tragedies, but history keeps moving towards its inevitable outcome. And that conflict between fate and human agency becomes one of the emotional foundations of the story. What's interesting is that the author is very transparent about the moments where history and fiction diverge. She has explained that when the story deviates from historical records, she always acknowledges it in her notes or in companion books, and that transparency actually strengthens the credibility of the narrative because it shows that the fictional elements are intentional rather than careless. One of the things I appreciate the most about this show is that it doesn't romanticize the past in a simplistic way like many other shows do. It's very beautiful, yes. The landscapes are breathtaking, the costumes are absolutely gorgeous, the music is incredible, but it also doesn't hide how brutal that world could be. Violence, war, trauma, the limitations imposed on women, those realities are present throughout the story. And this is something I want to mention carefully because I know it has been a huge point of discussion around the TV show. A lot of people have criticized Outlander for the way it portrays sexual violence and sexual assault. And of course, it's true that those scenes are incredibly hard to watch. They are meant to be like that. The show doesn't treat those moments lightly, and they are not easy television. But I think it's important to remember that the series doesn't present those events as spectacle or entertainment. It's showing how harsh life could be in that historical context. The past was not safe. It wasn't always romantic. It was often terrifying, actually, especially for women, but also for men. One of the boldest things the show did was depict a male character experiencing sexual assault, which is something period dramas have either done very poorly or have avoided completely. To be completely honest, Jamie's storyline in that prison episode was one of the most painful things I've ever watched on TV, and Sam Heughan's performance was absolutely insane. And I do think that this willingness to confront uncomfortable realities is actually part of what makes the series feel so historically grounded. Because Outlander isn't trying to show this polished, romantic fantasy version of the past. It's trying to show how life might have actually felt like, with all of its beauty, yes, but also all of the violence and all of its limitations. The same attention to historical texture appears in much smaller details as well, even in places viewers might not immediately notice. For example, the costume design. Jamie Fraser belongs to the clan Fraser of Lovett, which historically wore a red, green, and blue tartan. But in the TV series, his tartan appears to be in a muted gray and blue tones. At first, this confused a lot of viewers who were familiar with the real colors of the tartan. But the costume designers had a real specific reason for this choice. They researched the plants that would have been available in highlands at those times and asked a simple question. What colors could realistically be produced using natural dyes in that environment? So the result was a more muted palette that reflected the landscape itself. So even when the show changes historical details, it does so in a way that makes the world feel even more grounded. But the most fascinating thing about Outlander is not just how it tells its story. It's what happened after the show became popular, and it's something known as the Outlander effect. After the series premiered, Scotland experienced a huge increase in tourism connected directly to the show. Visit Scotland reported that some of these locations saw visitor numbers increase by more than 60%. That's an extraordinary impact for a television series. When Outlander started bringing visitors to these locations, it wasn't just about people wanting to take photos where scenes were filmed. Many of them became genuinely interested about the history behind the story. People began researching the Jacobite uprising. They visited the Collodion battlefield. They explored highland landscapes. They attended Gaelic seminars and historical tours inspired by the series. Universities even began discussing the cultural impact of Outlander in academic contexts. Preston Mill, which was a mill in East Linton that appeared in the series, had been struggling financially and needed restoration work. Fans of Outlander actually helped raise around £12,000 to support its preservation from their own pockets. Think about that for a second. That's an incredible demonstration of the relationship between storytelling and cultural heritage. And I get it. I try to visit Scotland at least once a year if I can. And last year, we were traveling through the Highlands and we ended up stopping in Falkland, which stands for Inverness in the first season. We were walking through the village and suddenly there it was, the Covenanter Hotel, the place where Claire and Frank stayed in the first episodes. And it felt so surreal. I think at some point I might just do a full Outlander tour at this point. But what I want to say is that I loved that moment so much. And I think it captures something essential about why Outlander has had such a huge cultural impact. Because the series doesn't just entertain people, it makes them curious. It makes them want to travel, to read about the historical events behind the story, to learn about Scotland's culture, history, language, even if they had no previous connection to it. And that is what I think Outlander needs to be considered and to be acknowledged as one of the most remarkable period dramas of the last decade. Not because it's flawless, because let's be honest, no show is, but because it achieved something that few shows managed to do. It didn't simply tell a story set in Scotland. It became intertwined with the way audiences around the world engage with Scottish history and heritage. So yes, I absolutely love Outlander as a story. But I think what makes it truly special is that it created this bridge between fiction and reality, between storytelling and cultural curiosity. What more could you ask from a series than that? Anyway, those are my thoughts about Outlander, and I would really love to know yours as well, especially now that season 8 has come out. If you've been watching the show for years like me, or if you're discovering it for the first time, let me know what your relationship with it has been. Thank you for listening to me talk about one of my favorite TV shows ever. Take care of yourselves, watch something beautiful, read something interesting, and I'll see you next time. Bye!